There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed, some forever, not for better. Some have gone and some remain. All these places have their moments. Rita!
Greetings, fellow scholar, and welcome to this week's episode of Avanexplains. In this episode, as you've probably guessed from the music that just played a while back, we're going to be looking at the fifth member of the Beatles. Yes, there probably was one, who they were, and what exactly allowed them to earn that title. So, without further ado, let's jump straight into it. On March the 8th, 2016, the world mourned the loss of a great member of the Beatles. Well, at least some did. You'd be given for not knowing Sir George Martin, but at the ripe old age of 90 when he passed away in his English home, the Beatles themselves took the time to remember how he had helped them gain the fame that had dominated the late 1970s, 80s, and early 90s. In fact, George Martin was the first person, or at least one of the first people, saving Brian Epstein, who we'll look at later, to sign a contract with the Beatles. He was actually their first main record producer and contract signer with them. Initially, he actually found their music to be unpromising, but their artistic talent and wit later persuaded him to continue on with them from 1962 until almost 1995. He had finally stepped down in 1995, and the Beatles would continue to record with fewer recordings and sort of less frequency, I suppose. But George Martin was to be remembered, and Paul McCartney himself took to Facebook shortly after his death and mentioned that if anybody earned the title of Fifth Beatle, it would have been George. George actually played the backing track in piano for some of the other Beatles songs, such as In My Life and Lovely Rita, the two songs you just heard at the beginning of this video. But before even George came onto the scene, there was one other key member of the Beatles who might as well have been immortalized for being the fifth Beatle had he not left the Beatles much earlier. I am, of course, referring to Brian Epstein, whom I previously mentioned. Brian was actually the first manager of the Beatles in a way. He first met the group in 1961 while they were playing for gigs at the Cavern Club in Liverpool, nowhere near as famous as they would be with him by their side, and over the years he would continue to be a great companion to the group, as well as help them secure those ever-present record deals that they needed in order to gain the fame and the money that was so important at the time. It was actually Brian who set up the fateful meeting with George Martin in 1962 that allowed the group to begin their road to fame. However, his time with the group was cut short in 1967 after he died of an overdose of drugs at the age of 32. It's actually kind of interesting that Paul McCartney again took to BBC in 1997 and in a documentary said that Brian Epstein would have earned the fifth Beatle. So maybe Paul McCartney's not that reliable when it comes to who is actually the fifth Beatle. But enough of that. Now we've had managers of the Beatles. What's next is obviously the former Beatles who came before the four that we know today. Just before their meeting with Brian Epstein in November of 1961, the Beatles had become a four-member band after losing their fifth member. Yes, I'm referring to bass guitarist Stuart Sutcliffe. Stuart met John Lennon while in university, and the two became bunkies in their Liverpool dorms. Stuart would later abandon his art career in pursuit of the band in Germany. He'd play in Hamburg and other cities around the European country in order to become acquainted with the band. Initially, Paul McCartney was very acclimatized to him. He wasn't quite so friendly around him because of how well he'd bonded with Lennon in university. Later, however, Stuart would leave the band in 1961 to be with his girlfriend. The poor man would die the year afterward due to a brain hemorrhage. No matter how he was remembered by the band, Stuart Sutcliffe was one of the original founding members of the Beatles, and for that, we can give him a spot as the fifth Beatle. In fact, he is immortalized in the band's album cover for the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and if you look closely, you'll see a fairly nondescript man that looks like Stuart Sutcliffe. There are other members of the group that can lay this claim to fame, but for the sake of time, I'm going to let you research them on your own and say that Stuart Sutcliffe was probably one of the best members of the Beatles for the Fifth Beatle role. Now let's look at some other more minor roles that still helped the Beatles out a lot in their travels. While John Lennon had Stuart Sutcliffe to hang out with in university, George Harrison and Paul McCartney had their own Fifth Beatle, who would come to be one of the major sort of minor members of the band. This is, of course, Neil Aspinall, their former schoolmate, and would become on to be the Beatles' personal manager. But before that, Neil Aspinall was a driver for the Beatles, actually driving them around in an old Kommer van that he picked up for £80 to their gigs in Hamburg and other parts of Germany. In fact, he quit his day job as an accountant because he was supposedly making more money just driving the Beatles from place to place than he was sitting at an office working at a table. Neil Aspinall would later climb up the ranks slowly, and when the Beatles went on tour, he would be there, driving them around to their concert venues, lugging their kit onto stage, and even becoming their personal assistant manager. He would go on to become the CEO of Apple Corps, no, not the one that makes iPhones, the ones that the Beatles made, and he would later pass on this role in 2007, dying at the age of 2008. There was also another person who we should thank for the title of Fifth Beatle, because he supposedly invented the actual term. Murray Kay, the disc jockey, otherwise known as Murray the K. A popular New York radio host, Murray actually welcomed the Beatles to America when they came in 1964, at the height of Beatlemania, that craze when the Beatles were the hip band on the streets in England and then in America. Murray the K would actually say that he was given Fifth Beatle by either Ringo Starr or George Harrison, but in many depictions he actually christened himself the Fifth Beatle, something he would actually later regret because of how limited a time he had with the band. But regardless, these are all applicable people for the Fifth Beatle title. And who actually is the Fifth Beatle? Well, there's no one correct answer, because there are so many more people who I won't mention in this video, but I wholeheartedly suggest you research. I'll put them down below. I suggest you research them because they actually had their own contributions to this band as well. And without them, the band could not have been as successful or indeed as well known as it is today. So without further ado, guys, that's the end of the video for now. Tune in next week on Avanexplains, and we're going to discover into a mystery this time. Mystery on the high seas. This is Avan, father of Avan's Alpaca Resources, signing out.